This is a quick reminder of the kind of things that you need to put into your literature essays. So you've got your first one on Wednesday the 14th of April. That's your modern text or your 19th century text. And then you have your second one on Monday the 19th of April, which is your Shakespeare text. So let's have a look and remind ourselves of the kind of things that you need to be including in those essays. So on the surface, it seems quite a straightforward essay. It's all about showing your knowledge, right? So do you understand the plot? Do you understand the characters? Do you have a few quotes? But it's much more than that. And I want to show you today how asking yourself some very simple questions can help you reach the next level, past just sharing your knowledge with the reader. The best literature essays show something of yourself to the reader. So every book, every story that's ever been written, yes, it was written for the writer because they enjoyed doing it and they wanted to write a story, but ultimately it's written for you. It's written for someone to read it. The story is written for someone to read it. So what you need to do is show in your essay that you have read it and that you have had a response to it. So there are some questions here that you can ask yourself. That at any point in the essay you could drop in comments that form an answer to any of these questions. So the first one is, what do you learn about the nature of the world from this story? Every story's got something to tell us. Every story. But what does it help you learn about the world? What does it tell you about what happens on an everyday basis? What does it tell you about life and the way that it unfolds for people? Second question is, what do you discover about people and humanity? Often you'll come across people in texts and books that you might never meet in real life. You come across individuals, for example, Macbeth, who kills a king to fulfill his inner ambitions. It's highly unlikely you're going to come across somebody who literally kills somebody. But you might come across people who go to extreme lengths to get what it is that they want. These are the sorts of questions that you need to ask yourself about the text that you've read, about the books that you've read, these stories. What have they taught you about people? What does Holmes teach us about people and humanity? If there isn't a lot to say about that, well, then you look at Watson. What is it that Watson teaches us about people and humanity when you look at him in relation to Holmes? What do the Burlings tell us about human nature? What in Frankenstein, how do we learn about what it means to be a human? What's it got to tell us about the nature of humanity? And then finally, another question you can ask yourself is, what do you understand that you didn't before? So it's very rare that you'll get to the end of a book and your life hasn't been altered remotely. I don't mean that you'll necessarily do anything differently, but you might think differently as a result of reading a story. You might view certain types of people differently. You might look at situations in a new way. So after reading Lord of the Flies, whenever you're involved in a group activity, you might view that differently. So these are the sort of questions that you can ask yourself to really get to the bottom of what this book has actually done for you. It's not just about showing your knowledge of it at all. It's about showing its impact on you. And if you can do that a couple of times in your essay, if you can really engage and show what you have learned, discovered or understood as a result of this story, then that's going to lift your essay to the next level. And by the next level, I don't mean marks. I mean that it will be really interesting to read. And that's how you get a good grade. The marks available for the essay are broken down in the following way. So AO1 is all about your knowledge of the text and the ideas within it. So everything that we've just looked at on the previous two slides, the plot, the characters, quotes, understanding what you can learn from the text, explaining what you discover about people, those thoughts are all about your AO1, so your knowledge of the text and the ideas within it. And that can get you 12 marks. There are 12 further marks available for your ability to explain the writer's choices. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, there are 6 marks available for linking to the wider context of the novel or the play. So let's work through these 3 areas and have a look at the sort of things that are listed in mark schemes and what we mean by this. How do you get the marks? So for AO1, to show your knowledge of the texts and the ideas within it, you will be required to explain what happens, who that happens to, when that happens, but most importantly, you need to answer that final 4th question. So what? So if you explain something that happens, explain why that matters. If someone was to ask you, yeah, so what? Make sure you can explain. Who does it happen to? Happens to this person. So what? Because by asking yourself, so what, you will expand your answer so it goes beyond just being about your knowledge of the text. It will go into those areas we've just talked about on the previous slides. It will go into explaining what you understand, what we learn and what we discover. So let's have a look at what that might look like. So let's pick up some marks for AO1. So first of all, explain what happens. Well, in Act 1, Scene 5, Tybalt sees Romeo at the Capulet Ball. That's what happens. Great. But so what? So in green, I explain so what. This moment is essential in the development of tension in the play, as this is what leads to the death of Mercutio, Tybalt, and ultimately the banishment of Romeo to Mantua. Without this moment, the rest of the events in the play would probably not happen. Then you look at who this happens to and again explain so what. Well, this moment shows Tybalt being shamed by his uncle for trying to disrupt the ball. This is who's in this moment, Tybalt and his uncle. So what? This is an exchange in pink that has repercussions that we already suspect will be significant, as we have seen Tybalt's antagonistic and violent nature already in Act 1, Scene 1, when he tells Benvolio to turn and face his death. So what I've done there, I've said what happens and I've said who to, but I've really explained why those things matter. Why is this moment important? So what? Why is it in there? And why does it matter that it's Tybalt and Capulet? So I've got a tip for you now about how you can pick up some AO2 marks and transition nicely from your AO1 paragraph. So you've explained what happens and who to, and you've explained so what. Now, when you start to look at the when it happens, that still links to AO1 because it's all about what actually takes place. But by looking at when something happens, what you're starting to do is explain a writer's choices, because the writers decided, Shakespeare decided, to have Tybalt see Romeo at the Capulet Ball. He made that decision for that to happen then. That's a structural decision. That is a plot line. That is a decision that the writer has made. So this is where you can start picking up marks for explaining what the writer has actually done and explaining why. So AO2, it's not just about the words they use, it's also about when the writer has decided to make things happen. So here's what this might look like when you start writing about when something happens. So this exchange happens right before Romeo and Juliet see each other for the first time. So what? Well, in green, as such, Shakespeare has created a moment that is heavy with irony. He's already told the audience what is going to happen to the two young lovers. This moment makes us feel even more dismayed when they finally meet, because Shakespeare shows that the cards are stacked against them in so many ways. Then I'd finish off this paragraph with what we learn, discover or understand. So in blue, this moment is so significant in the development of the plot, and it shows us that pride and reputation can be the difference between acting rationally and behaving dangerously and recklessly, because what follows this moment is the natural response of somebody like Tybalt. In this exchange between Capulet and Tybalt, Shakespeare reveals how destructive embarrassment can be to the ego, and how it can lead us to do rash things to save our reputation. So now what we'll do, or what you would do, is a swan paragraph. You would have a look at the language used here. So you might talk about when Tybalt talks about the fact that his the sweet intrusion shall convert to bitterest gall. So you could look at any of those words, but have a look at that. You could have a look at Capulet repeating to Tybalt, he shall be endured, you will endure him. The fact that he repeats this shows his power, shows Tybalt's lack of power and his status in the hierarchy of the family. So this is kind of like a segue in. So you look at what happens, to who. When you start looking at when this happens, start using the name of the writer. So bring in the writer. When did this happen? Why has the writer done it at this point? And then you can start looking at the language and pick up your AO2 with your swan paragraphs. So there are 6 more marks that you can pick up for linking to the context. Now, context, just to be clear, is everything. If you think about any moment, any person, any event, nothing happens in isolation. Nothing just happens in a split second. If you have a fire, something's happened before that. If you have a wedding, something's led up to that. Equally, things will happen afterwards. So context is the bigger picture in which something takes place, and nothing takes place in isolation. Everything has a before, a present and an after. So we've already done a little bit of this because we've talked already about what happens in the wider novel, in the wider play of Romeo and Juliet. We've already linked, therefore, to the context. We know the significance of this moment in context with the rest of the moments in the play. So you can pick up context points for talking about the wider novel or play. You can also pick up context points for looking at the wider world. So move outwards, which we've also already done, and we've talked about human nature, we've talked about embarrassment, the ego, what happens when people act recklessly. So you're linking into the real world, what happens outside of this story. And you can also pick up marks for context by looking at contemporary context, so looking at the context of life when the play or novel was written. And you can also look at a modern perspective. So in our generation, in our day and age, it would be highly unlikely, although possible, but unlikely and definitely unreasonable, if somebody were to go after somebody and try to kill them or fight them to the death because they turned up at a party that they weren't supposed to be at. It might happen in certain contexts, in certain circumstances, but it's highly unusual. For a contemporary audience, however, for an Elizabethan audience, it would be far more reasonable that Tybalt would respond like that, because to him this is an issue of honour. It's all about family pride, it's about reputation, it's about somebody being on his turf. So by looking at modern versus contemporary context, that will help you add another layer to your explanation of the moment in question. Metaphorically, you can view a literature essay as you getting increasingly further outside of the text. So AO1, you're right in the book, so you're looking at what happens, to who and why. AO2, you step out of the book and you look at it as a construct. You look at the writer's choices. So why has the writer done what they've done? What did the writer decide to do? What kind of language have they used? What's the structure? So you step outside a bit more. And then AO3, you step right away and you look outside, away from the text completely, keeping it in your mind, but you look at the wider world and you look at all of the ideas in the book, all of the emotions of what it tells us again about human nature. Look at it in relation to what you know already about the world. How does it add to your knowledge and understanding of who we are as people? So if you view it in that way, hopefully that will be helpful. So you're in the book, close focus, move out slightly, look at it as a construct, which is what it is. It's something that's been made or built by a writer, and then look outwards, look up and outwards, and see how this book fits in with the world that you know. Here are some examples of mark schemes from AQA, and hopefully, if you have a look through, look at what's required for AO1, then look at what's required for AO2, and then have a look at AO3. And even if this isn't the text that you've studied, there are texts up there for all of you, but you should be able to see from the wording of the mark scheme that what we've just done in this video is come up with ways in which we can meet these requirements. So you'll see the AO3 mark scheme statements say things like links between, ideas about, contemporary attitude towards. So that's what they're looking for AO3. For AO2, you've got lots of how sentence starters and presentation of. So how Golding does this, how this character is presented, the use of, narrator, and so on. And then for AO1, you've got lots of what's. So what happens, who is involved here, details about this character. So you can see what we've just talked about is exactly what's required on the mark scheme. AO1, what happens, to who, and so what. AO2, when does this happen, what kind of language is used, how does the writer present that particular character or moment. And then AO3, links to ideas, links to the world, modern and contemporary. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Do your best next week. You'll be absolutely fantastic.